The moment my husband introduced me to his business partner, I smiled politely and reached for my wine glass. Then I heard him lean closer and whisper something in flawless Spanish. "Tonight, she's yours." They both laughed because they believed I couldn't understand a single word. I smiled back as if nothing had happened. 15 minutes later, everything changed. One phone call, one sentence, and the color drained from my husband's face in front of everyone. That was the night he realized he'd made one mistake he could never undo, assuming I didn't understand the language he used to betray me. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 31 years old, and until 6 months ago, I believed I had the kind of marriage people secretly wished they had. I worked as a senior marketing strategist for a healthcare company in Chicago, while my husband, Daniel, owned a growing software consulting firm that had recently started attracting international investors. We had been married for 8 years, shared a beautiful townhouse overlooking the river, and spent nearly every weekend exploring new restaurants or planning our next vacation. From the outside, our life looked perfect. Maybe that's why I ignored the little things. Daniel had always been open with me, but lately he seemed different. His phone never left his hand. Business trips became more frequent. Late-night meetings suddenly appeared on his calendar, without warning. Whenever I asked if everything was okay, he'd smile, kiss my forehead, and tell me the company was simply growing faster than expected. I wanted to believe him. After all, I had supported his dreams since the day he opened his business from our tiny apartment. I'd watched him work 18-hour days, survive difficult clients, and slowly build something incredible. I was proud of everything he'd accomplished. Then one Friday evening, he surprised me. "Get dressed," he said with an excited smile. "Tonight's important." "Important how?" "I finally want you to meet the man who's helping take this company to the next level." His new business partner. I'd heard Daniel mention him dozens of times over the previous few months. According to him, Alejandro Ruiz was brilliant, wealthy, and well-connected throughout Latin America. Together they were negotiating a partnership that could double the company's value within a year. Daniel seemed genuinely excited.
So was I.
That Saturday evening we arrived at an elegant private restaurant downtown where investors and executives filled the room. Crystal chandeliers reflected off polished marble floors while soft piano music drifted through the air. Every table was covered with white roses and candlelight, making the entire place feel more like a celebration than a business dinner. Alejandro greeted us immediately. He was charming, confident, and surprisingly friendly. He hugged Daniel like they'd known each other for years before turning toward me with a warm smile. "So this is your beautiful wife." Daniel introduced us, and Alejandro politely kissed my hand before pulling out my chair. For the first hour, everything felt perfectly normal. They discussed expansion plans, international contracts, and future investments while I listened with genuine interest. Occasionally, they exchanged quick remarks in Spanish whenever another guest joined the conversation. Daniel had always assumed I didn't understand the language. Most people did. What almost nobody knew was that my grandmother had moved from Madrid before my mother was born. Every summer of my childhood had been spent listening to Spanish around the dinner table. By the time I finished high school, I spoke it almost as comfortably as English. I rarely mentioned it. There simply had never been a reason. Dinner ended, and everyone gathered near the bar with glasses of wine. Daniel leaned toward Alejandro, believing I was admiring the skyline outside the window. Then he quietly spoke in flawless Spanish. "Tonight, she's yours." They both smiled. My heart stopped, but I didn't let a single emotion reach my face. Instead, I slowly lifted my wine glass, smiled exactly the way they expected me to, and decided I would let them keep believing I hadn't understood a single word. I forced myself to breathe normally. Every instinct screamed at me to throw my wine in Daniel's face, demand an explanation, and walk straight out of the restaurant. Instead, I smiled. If they believed I understood nothing, then they would keep talking. And that was exactly what I needed. I laughed at the right moments, complimented the food, and even asked Alejandro about his recent trip to Buenos Aires. He answered politely before turning back toward Daniel. Within seconds, they slipped into Spanish again, speaking quickly enough that anyone unfamiliar with the language would assume they were discussing business. I understood every word. It's easier than I expected, Alejandro murmured. Daniel chuckled softly. She trusts me completely. The words felt like ice sliding down my spine. I kept my expression relaxed while slowly setting my wineglass onto the table. A waiter arrived with dessert, giving me a few precious seconds to steady myself. When he left, the conversation continued. Alejandro asked, "Are you certain she won't suspect anything?" Daniel shook his head confidently. "Emily never questions me. That's one of the things I admire about her." Admire? What an interesting choice of word. Not love. Not respect. Admire. They continued discussing schedules, meetings, and paperwork. At first, everything sounded like ordinary business until Daniel casually mentioned my signature. Once the final documents are ready, she'll sign without reading every page. Alejandro raised an eyebrow. And if she does read them? Daniel smiled. She won't. She trusts me. A strange calm settled over me. The shock was slowly being replaced by clarity. This wasn't simply about another woman. It wasn't about an affair. It was about using my trust as part of a larger plan. I quietly unlocked my phone beneath the table. Without drawing attention, I opened the voice recorder and slipped the phone beside my purse. Their conversation continued. Alejandro lowered his voice. "The investors are nervous. They won't be once everything is transferred," Daniel replied. "And afterward?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "She'll think the restructuring was necessary." Restructuring? My mind immediately raced through every conversation we'd had over the previous month. Daniel had recently convinced me to become a minority shareholder in one of his new companies. He'd insisted it was simply for tax purposes. Had those documents been something entirely different? I kept listening. Every sentence added another missing piece. They weren't talking about romance anymore. They were discussing ownership percentages, control, assets, timelines. Alejandro finally asked the question that made everything painfully clear. "So, after next week, she'll have no legal control?" Daniel nodded. "Exactly." Neither man noticed my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. Neither noticed my heartbeat pounding inside my ears. Because I kept smiling. Dinner eventually ended, and guests began moving toward the ballroom where drinks and networking continued. Daniel excused himself to greet another executive. Alejandro followed a group of investors across the room. For the first time all evening, I was alone. I walked calmly into the ladies' lounge, locked myself inside a quiet stall, and replayed the recording. Every word was crystal clear. I immediately forwarded the audio to my older sister, Olivia, a corporate attorney who had spent nearly a decade handling business fraud and contract disputes. I added only one sentence. "Don't call. Listen to this first. Tell me if I'm hearing what I think I'm hearing." Less than 3 minutes later, my phone vibrated. Olivia had already listened. Her reply contained only 8 words. "Everything is confirmed. Do exactly what we discussed." I stared at Olivia's message for several seconds before slipping my phone back into my purse. My heartbeat had finally slowed. The fear was gone. In its place was something much stronger. Certainty. When I stepped back into the ballroom, nothing had changed for anyone else. Crystal glasses clinked together. Executives laughed over expensive whiskey. Investors exchanged business cards while a jazz trio played softly near the stage. Daniel looked completely relaxed. He smiled the moment he saw me. "There you are," he said, wrapping an arm around my waist. "Everyone's asking where you've been." I just needed a minute. He kissed my forehead, completely unaware that I now knew exactly who he was. Alejandro raised his glass toward me. "Everything all right?" I smiled warmly. "Better than ever." 15 minutes later, Daniel tapped his glass with a spoon to get everyone's attention. "I'd like to thank all of you for believing in this partnership," he announced. "Tonight marks the beginning of something extraordinary." Applause filled the room. He turned toward me proudly. "And I especially want to thank my incredible wife. She supported me through every challenge." More applause. I waited until the room became quiet again. Then I gently lifted my own glass. "If no one minds," I said, "I'd like to thank 2 people as well." Daniel smiled. "Of course." I looked directly at Alejandro. Then I spoke in flawless Spanish. Thank you for believing I couldn't understand a single word tonight. Every smile disappeared instantly. Alejandro's face froze. Daniel blinked once. I continued in Spanish, calmly repeating every sentence they had spoken. Tonight, she's yours. She trusts me completely. Once the final documents are ready, she'll sign without reading every page. After next week, she'll have no legal control. The ballroom became so silent I could hear someone set down a wine glass across the room. Daniel's face turned completely white. Emily, he whispered. I switched back to English. You underestimated one very important detail. No one moved. I understood every conversation, every plan, every lie. Alejandro slowly stepped backward.
This isn't what?
It doesn't matter what you say now, I interrupted calmly. The conversations were recorded, reviewed by an attorney, and safely stored before I walked back into this room. Several investors exchanged uneasy glances. One board member quietly lowered his champagne. Daniel reached toward me. Please, let's talk somewhere private. I took one step back. For months, I believed our marriage was built on honesty. I looked around the room. Tonight, I discovered it was built on assumptions. Daniel's shoulders collapsed. He finally understood. Not because I had embarrassed him, because he had lost complete control of the story. Without another word, Alejandro walked toward the exit. No handshake, no explanation, no partnership worth defending. I placed my wedding ring on the table beside Daniel's untouched drink. You didn't lose me tonight because I understood Spanish. I met his eyes one last time. You lost me the day you decided trust was something you could exploit. Then I turned and walked toward the doors. Nobody tried to stop me. Behind me, the silence said more than any apology ever could. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't walking away from my marriage. I was walking toward my own future.